Ari Lewis Show.
Welcome, everybody, to another episode of the Ari Lewis Show here on Israel Sports and News Radio. Thank you for joining us. At any time, you can email the program at arilewishow@hotmail.com or the radio station Israel Sports News Radio at gmail.com. A lot of people thought boxing would be dead after Floyd Mayweather's quote-unquote retirement. It seems to be alive and well. Tyson Fury, the new heavyweight champion of the world. Good or bad thing, and other things going on in boxing. On the line to discuss this is America's best boxing writer. He's the author of the Domino Diaries, also director of Split Decision. We'll talk about that boxer involved in that movie, Guerrero Rigondo. Back to the program. My favorite boxing writer, my favorite guest really at the end of the day, Brin-Jonathan Butler. Brin, how you doing out there?
I'm great. How are you?
Doing great. So let's talk about Tyson Fury. He gets the victory over Vladimir Klitschko, a 27-year-old British guy. He seems to offer something a little bit different than the Klitschkos, who had a bit of a broken English, very smart, but really weren't accepted by the American public. So how is Tyson Fury going to feel the wrath of the Americans?
Well, he's, I think, fired a shot across the bow with his views on women, saying that their places in the kitchen are on their back. That hasn't gone over all that well.
Yeah, that's not smart.
No, the self-proclaimed Gypsy King, I think Gypsy itself is pretty much universally regarded as a slur now, despite I have it in my own bloodline with my mother, but still, he's just an odd character. He's a definite character. He wins the heavyweight title and sings an Aerosmith ballad to his wife in the front row. He's interesting. He's fun. He's strange. I think he's going to be heavyweight champion probably until his next fight, regardless of who the opponent is. So I think we should enjoy him while he's there.
So he's maybe just kind of milking the 15 minutes. That's what you think. He's not a long-lasting guy.
I mean, he's 6'9" and 240 pounds, and I think it was probably the most boring heavyweight title fight I've seen in about 10 years, which is saying something, going back to the days of probably the worst moniker for a boxer ever, John the Quiet Man Ruiz, some of his historic reign of just total ineptitude and passivity. I mean, Fury has some potential, and I think he deserves full credit. He just broke the will of Klitschko. Klitschko realized for the first time in a long time, almost a decade, he was champ for 9.5 years, his most recent reign. Long time, Joe Louis territory. The moment that he couldn't overwhelm somebody with his size advantages, that he could actually get hit, he was within range. If he fired at his opponent, he couldn't hold them to no end. I mean, referees have been allowing him to hold his opponents and put his forearm on the back of their head throughout fights, almost without any warning, let alone deducting points, despite the illegality of that style. Fury wouldn't permit that. He was a little taller than Klitschko. He's listed at 6'9", might be an inch or two smaller than that, but he's definitely taller, had a longer reach than Klitschko. And Klitschko landed an average of 4 punches a round in that fight. He was afraid to punch. He looked tired. He looked gassed. He looked confused. And Fury deserves credit for that. He was game. He was talking to him. It wasn't an exciting fight by any means, but it was very interesting to see somebody, I think, expose Klitschko for somebody unwilling to sort of defend their title, and it's not a very honorable performance on Klitschko's part. We didn't see what he was capable of doing because he didn't want to take any risks, and that's been a big criticism of him throughout his reign as champion. So that was interesting. The fight itself wasn't.
You talk about the risk. I mean, I've seen fights where Klitschko's won just with the jab, without having to throw a right hand at all, because he can get away with it. And you talk about him being champion for over 9 years. This is going to sound kind of weird, but I almost feel like he'll be the forgotten champion. I think there was a period of his reign where if you ask the average American, who is the heavyweight champion of the world, I think a lot of them would say, I don't know. So give us your thoughts about Klitschko's 9+ year reign as heavyweight champion.
I think you're absolutely right. I think that he almost never fought in the United States. He'd fight in Germany against you or me or whatever off-duty taxi driver was willing to take him on, or ditch digger. I mean, these were people nobody had ever heard of, and generally they were pretty boring fights where you could wear people down with the jab, and after they got too tired or bored or hypnotized, he'd put them to sleep with the right hand sometimes. So it's a strange reign that he had. Him and his brother are the only heavyweight champions. I think there's only been a couple who had college degrees. Both these guys have PhDs in sports science. They're very bright. They're multilingual. But they never captured the American imagination, and they could make $50 million every fight, fighting very easy fights. They took very little damage. Vladimir, I think he lost 3 or 4 times throughout his career when somebody caught him. Never had a great chin, and adapted his style after the knockout 10 years ago to a very safety-first style to utilize his physical advantages. It's a smart adjustment, but in terms of generating excitement, it never did. And, I mean, boxing has really moved away from sort of the traditional people who were champ to becoming much more of a Hispanic sport. And then in the region of what was formerly Russia, we're seeing a lot of these great characters coming out. Most notably, I think, Golovkin. But also in the heavyweight ranks, you're seeing, the Klitschkos from the Ukraine. So we're not seeing Americans really stepping up to the plate. It seems like they're being fed into the other sports, which is probably a wise decision, but it certainly has left boxing as more of a fringe sport. So you have Deontay Wilder, who I saw him actually on Saturday at the fights in Brooklyn, looks much more like a basketball player than a boxer. But, I mean, he has won one of these titles, and he didn't really win legitimately by beating one of the Klitschko brothers. But he's definitely somebody to look out for in terms of fighting Fury down the road. But has he really captured the imagination in America? Well, he's trying to, but it doesn't seem to have happened yet. So I think we're still, after Mike Tyson, I think boxing is, really stepped off the front page. It's still in the back pages. Mayweather definitely carried it. But Mayweather was a champion people rooted to see lose. They weren't really cheering for him. Tyson, I think people did cheer for. As many people cheered for him to win as to lose. So it'll be interesting to see who the next big American champion to sort of step up, to the limelight. I don't think we see him on the horizon yet.
Again, this is the Ari Lewis Show on Israel Sports News Radio, joined by Brin-Jonathan Butler. So, Brin, let's put Klitschko's reign in perspective. Over 9 years, even though safety first style, big, tall guy, I mean, he's clearly not top 10. Is he top 20?
Well, I think he is top 20 or maybe top 10 in that just his size. I mean, if you're going to say in your imagination, all this is so subjective in rating these guys. Would Joe Louis at 6'2", 190, 195 pounds really want to trade with a guy who's 6'6", 250? It would be a pretty scary prospect for Louis. So I don't know if it's a fair comparison just generationally, but he's a very, very difficult guy to fight if a referee is going to allow him to use his advantages the way he wants to. Very difficult. I think he hits harder, arguably, than any heavyweight in history just because of his size and athleticism in punching. Freddie Roach told me, who worked with a lot of heavyweights, including Mike Tyson, that far and away Vladimir was the heaviest puncher he ever worked with on the mitts. So I would put him in the top 20. I just think I'm not really going to miss him now that he's gone. I think his brother, Vitaly, was the better fighter. I think if you had some mythic matchup of the two brothers fighting, I would favor Vitaly. Most boxing writers I've spoken to would as well. I don't think Vitaly ever really lost a fight. Had some controversial losses because of a cut over his eye with Lennox Lewis or an shoulder injury with Chris Bird, but he really never lost. And when the fight was stopped with Lewis, he was winning that fight. Granted, it was a Lewis who was a bit out of shape and older, but Vitaly was a much more interesting fighter. Vladimir had the better tools, but Vitaly was the better boxer, the better spirit, made for more exciting fights. So I think you're right that history, as far as popularity, and he never really captured the imagination, but I think he does deserve the respect in history, and both him and his brother, I think, will be in the Boxing Hall of Fame.
All All right, interesting case for the Klitschko brothers. Let's move on. Let's talk about Rigo. Obviously, you know him quite well. Still undefeated, although a lot of boxers are ducking him. Gets the victory about a week and a half ago. So what's next for Rigondeaux?
Well, I think optimally it would be a fight against Lomachenko. He didn't do himself any favors since signing a 4-year, $10 million contract with Jay-Z, which will obviously he's very appreciative of. But he got on HBO, fought a relative nobody, a journeyman, game journeyman with a lot of knockouts on his record. But because of, I mean, it's kind of similar to the Klitschko and Fury fight in some ways. Basically, the opponent was unwilling to sort of bring the fight to Rigo, and Rigo is very content to, I think he averaged 7 punches landed per round, which for a 122-pound guy is, you know, very, very passive. But he posed such a threat in terms of what his counterpunching can do that his opponent was content to survive absolutely brutally boring 10-round fight. So Rigo cashed his check, but on an HBO platform, and he'd been ostracized to fighting, you know, in the corners of the world in Japan and other regions to really no American exposure, let alone major, you know, TV or cable exposure. It was a very poor performance that affirmed what a lot of critics have said about him, that he really shouldn't be on in front of American audiences on platforms like HBO, and that was a real shame to see. I wish he would have capitalized a little more on the opportunity, but that's kind of been the story with him all along, that he has his own way of doing things, and like Mayweather, it's safety first, and it was good for him, and he's content to do just enough to win. But it certainly displeased an audience that booed throughout the fight.
Let's go to Rigo's mental state. I mean, we talked about this for years. We talked about his paranoia. He doesn't really trust people. Has he gotten any more trusting and more comfortable doing what he does, his lifestyle, or is he the same guy as he was 4 or 5 years ago?
I think it's a little different in that he's remarried. He just had a child. I think he's more and more putting his life behind him in Cuba. I don't know how much he can. I still think the scars are there of leaving behind a wife and 2 kids. Certainly the political situation in which he left was a very, very difficult, traumatic one. So, you know, he just has a way about him that just looks very, you know, as you say, paranoid, sullen, not very open to sort of embracing people. And it's very difficult, I think, you know, in boxing or just as a, you know, as trying to be an attraction. If your attitude is, I want to get everything that's in it for me and give as little as possible, it's very rare that those kind of people are embraced. It happens, but it's rare. And I think while Rigondeaux has a narrative that certainly entranced me as somebody who, you know, made a film about him and wrote a book about him, but it's been really hard to get him to sort of want to share that story. I mean, very often the most interesting story that people have to tell is the one they don't want to tell. And in his case, it's just writ large with all the politics involved and you know, everything that's gone on with the United States and Cuba. But that's a story that either he doesn't want to tell or he's afraid to tell. And, you know, maybe he has a right to that. I mean, he certainly does have a right not to, but I kind of wish that he was willing to just maximize his potential. He's already 35 years old, and he certainly hasn't done himself any favors in terms of marketing himself to as broad an audience as possible. Never learned English. He's been here now for almost 7 years. So, you know, it's a choice he makes, and I guess he deserves respect for sticking to his guns. But he's another one like Klitschko that if he doesn't make more of an effort to meet his audience, I don't think he's going to be that missed. And I think that's a real shame. I think history will look back at a real missed opportunity with his career. And as I say, to see him at 35, there's not a lot of time left, you'd have to think.
Yeah, indeed. I want to know, there seems to be improved relations between the United States and Cuba, at least in some form. Any type of effect there? I don't imagine Rigo's ever going back to Cuba under any circumstance, although you never know. But would that have any type of effect on him if there is less tension between the two nations?
Well, certainly it's possible. There have been baseball players who defected, were, as has traditionally been done by Castro and his government, were labeled traitors and branded in such, essentially the choice to defect was committing social suicide in Cuba. Redondo, that was a bigger deal because he was a two-time Olympic champion. But there is now some precedent for guys going back, and Castro has opened the door to, after 7 years being gone, that you are legally allowed to return. Now, I don't know that Redondo would. I know he has been paranoid even traveling outside of the United States, that there would be agents following him, and, it becomes like a John le Carre spy novel. And who knows how true it is? I mean, the history between the two governments with the U.S. and Cuba is filled with spy versus spy type things of the CIA trying to, plant poison to have Castro's beard fall out, or turn a cigar into a stick of dynamite and these kind of things. I mean, it sounds crazy, but these things actually did happen. So I don't know how much is paranoia or realistic fear of reprisal, but there has been precedent of athletes going back to Cuba and returning to the United States. So I would hope, just for his well-being and I think the good of the two countries, that normalizing relations could help heal this rift and the wounds that led over 1 million Cubans to leave the island since Castro took power. I mean, 1 million people risked their lives, where almost 30% of them died if they tried to cross the Florida Straits. It's a lot of people, in a mass exodus that has left, I think, every family on the island and those that fled broken and kind of shattered. It's still licking their wounds, and I think it's still an open wound for most Cubans. So I've always thought of it sort of as like a civil war fought across 90 miles. And I think even the American Civil War is still felt all these years later. I think it's a similar situation with the Cubans.
Again, this is the Ari Lewis Show on Israel Sports and News Radio, joined by Brin-Jonathan Butler, America's finest boxing writer. And we're going to talk about one of my favorite boxers of all time, a guest on my program 4 years ago. That was back, I don't know how to say this in a nice way, but he was fighting Max Alexander. I kind of thought that was the end of the road, but he's still fighting. That's Roy Jones Jr., former heavyweight champion of the world. Roy, believe it or not, is fighting in a few days this weekend in Moscow. So, Bryn, why in the world is Roy Jones Jr. still fighting?
Why in the world is somebody who has gone to Las Vegas and lost their wife and lost their house and lost their family and lost the self-respect of everybody they know, eager to wake up in the morning and head back to the craps tables? I think he is as addicted as any. He personifies addiction more than any person I have ever encountered in my life. That's the easiest way to put it. And his addiction is to something that he has devoted his life to more thoroughly than any boxer I've ever met. He has been boxing seriously and competitively for as old as I am now, which is 36 years. He began at 10, and from there he told me he was running 11 miles a day, every day, and that's led to his knees being absolutely terrible now. He walks like a 75-year-old construction worker. I spent a week with him in Pensacola a month and a half ago for a profile I've written about him that will come out in Bleacher Report on December 9th. And his attitude is that all the talent that he had, and I think probably you'd agree, he might be the most talented athlete ever to get involved in boxing. He felt that all of that talent merits, when the end of his life happens and he greets God, that the conversation they will have will not include God saying, I gave you all this talent and this is all you did? This? And I kind of said to him, like, don't you think you've done enough? Like, I mean, you've done enough to get into the Hall of Fame 2 or 3 times over. But in his mind, it's not enough. There's still more to do. And anybody who says otherwise, anybody who criticizes him for staying in the sport, for him that just sort of bangs the drum to do even more bold things. And that's a very scary prospect for people who care about him. And having spent a week with him, I liked him a lot more than I did even beforehand. I'd always heard he was a good, decent person, and I met all of his family, his wife, his children, his uncle, his father, and as I say, spent a lot of time with him, and he is a very likable, decent, good person, a good husband, a great father, and a loyal friend, and it's sad just to know the risk that he's potentially exposing himself to in the short term, and maybe even more ominous, the risk he's exposing himself to in the long term.
Yeah, I mean, I don't even know where to begin with that. He's going to be 47 in January, and it's not exactly he's fighting guys who setting the world on fire. I mean, this weekend is a gentleman named, I hope I pronounce his name right if he's listening, Enzo Martinelli. Before that, it was Eric Watson, Paul Vasquez. Really, I mean, you guys get the point. He really hasn't fought anyone noteworthy in about 5.5 years. That'd be Bernard Hopkins. That was the rematch. So, I just want to say, kind of on a personal note, I really became a fan of boxing because of Roy Jones Jr. The first fight I really saw that I was really intrigued in was when he fought David Telesco, and I noticed that he was really into the rap music. He came in with Wu-Tang Clan, and he fought a guy that wasn't in his class, but he made it entertaining. He danced around, he talked with him. He was just Roy Jones had the knack of he could fight nobody, and you would still watch. Do you agree with that?
Oh yeah, no, he was a total genius. I say in the article, it's interesting when you look back at the great fighters in boxing, because if you compare them to something musically, you have like a Muhammad Ali, where the memory of him, of his greatness, is all in the duets. It's all in the rivalries that he had. The great opponents he fought is where he cemented his legacy. Mike Tyson's different. Mike Tyson didn't need to fight anybody. He was kind of his own orchestra, making a symphony on his own. There was enough of a backstory. He was so compelling. Roy Jones is a little different. He's more just one instrument. He's a soloist. And as you say, it was enough because his majesty with what he was doing, I think, is kind of analogous to somebody like Charlie Parker in jazz, which people who appreciate jazz, they say, God, nobody could touch this guy for the virtuosity. He had an extra gear that nobody could get close to. But for the general population, as they say with boxing and jazz, like the best jazz is the stuff that most people can't stand. And a lot of people say that about boxing too. I think it's interesting that Jones never found a big audience worthy of his talent. He just never did. He was never a pay-per-view attraction. He never made the big money that a lot of these other guys do, despite the fact that I think he was a better fighter than Floyd Mayweather. I think he was a better fighter than Mike Tyson and several other big-name fighters that generated huge amounts of money and publicity. Jones never attracted that. He sort of plied his trade just a little bit differently, and it's left him. A lot of people have said that he might be in some financial straits. Certainly lives on a big property, didn't seem to live a very flashy lifestyle, but some people have suggested that money is a reason he's still in the game, which is very sad considering all the success he's had.
Yeah, one of the things also I liked about him, real independent spirit. I mean, one of the reasons why he didn't make the big money is because he ignored working with Don Kane until he kind of had to in 2003 to fight John Ruiz. But he was very critical of Don Kane. He was saying Bernard Hopkins was basically his B word, but then he had to work with him because at the end of the day, Don Kane is the gangster you may not like, but you have to deal with him in some capacity if you want to make the big dollars, right?
That's right. I mean, you're absolutely right. He was a very independent, free spirit, and a lot of that comes back to he got into boxing because of an incredibly overbearing father. Roy did elect himself to become a boxer. He wasn't forced to do it, but the dynamic reminded me a lot of Michael Jackson and his father, Joe Jackson, like a very unhealthy, just very unhealthy relationship that they almost blend into the same person in some respects, and yet they can't be together. Roy hadn't spoken to his father when I got to Pensacola for 11 years, and when he took me to meet him, it was basically, the conversation went like this, with zero eye contact, I might add. Can you talk to this guy? And Roy Sr. said, yep. And Roy Jr. just immediately turned and got in the car and began to drove off before I said, Roy, I don't have a ride to get home. where are you going? Like, I'm supposed to be following you around. And he said, okay, Dad, can you drop him off at his hotel? I'll pick him up there later. Yep. And then off he was, gone. And, 11 years not talking to your dad, and I said things like, are you, your dad's getting up there in age. Are you afraid of not kind of reconciling, making amends with this guy? And he said, no, he's gone to me. So I said, so if he dies, you're not going to feel any remorse? And he said, no, he's been gone to me for years. So
Wow.
There was just a lot of pain and resentment there. And I think a lot of that led into freeing himself from his dad. I'm not trying to psychoanalyze too much, but a lot of this saying in the sport seemed to me like proof that he's the tougher man between him and his dad. And yeah, it was almost like a Shakespearean dynamic between the two of them. They were so closely tied in some respects, but so different in others. His dad was a very violent father, especially where the application of boxing was viciously violent. And Roy, I don't think, has ever so much as spanked one of his children. I think the imprint that the father left on him is something that's affected his code of conduct with other people. He never wants to become his father in these ways that wounded him so deeply, and that wound was a very, very deep one. So I think a lot of that explains why boxing is a place that he still feels very safe, and he's just clinging to it with such ferocity. It's for both you and me and many other people, it's totally inexplicable given how much he's achieved, but he is, from what I could see, nowhere near willing to let go.
Oh, incredible. And, whatever it's worth, according to Celebrity Net Worth, he's worth $20 million, and people might think that's a lot of money. But if you think about that, Floyd made that for one round of boxing last, spring, and it was a real boring round. Actually, all 12 were. It's just kind of insane. It's really unfathomable. And at this point, as I mentioned, he'll be 47 pretty soon. I mean, is he going to go to 55? Like, does he stop when there is a serious physical injury? Is that what's going to keep him from going?
That's exactly when he's going to stop. His defense of what he was doing was to say, all God has to do is have me fail one MRI exam. All God has to do is, take out one of my eyes so that I can't fight anymore. So obviously, and I'm speaking in his voice to me, obviously God wants me to keep going. And this is not my path. This is not hubris. This is God's path. And so I, maybe a little cheekily, but I didn't mean it that way. Maybe I did. I asked, has God ever sort of commanded you to do something that you didn't really want to do anyway? And he said, well, no, that's kind of strange. No, he always does sort of send me on these missions that I want to be on my own anyway. And I said, well, doesn't that make you kind of question this? Like, are you trying to get God to underwrite basically things you want to do that otherwise you might have doubts about it? For example, his wife and kids were not thrilled watching him get knocked out in Russia by Lebedev, brutally knocked out. It's really hard on them. It's really hard on his family, who just adores him, to see him get hurt, to see him get concussed, to see it take 15 minutes to remove him from the ring. And his defense is just, all God has to do is to show any signs of brain damage, and then they won't let me fight. But do you hear me slurring my words? Do I sound like a punch-drunk fighter? So as I mentioned before, it's trying to talk a gambler away from the Las Vegas tables. Good luck. Good luck. They've all the prestige that Roy had with his fights, fighting huge name guys. I mean, fought for the heavyweight championship against the Quiet Man. Almost had a Tyson fight after that. I mean, had he retired after Ruiz, winning the heavyweight title, going all the way up from 154 to a heavyweight title, which nobody's done in over 100 years, made his biggest payday of his career. I think he was undefeated. I mean, pretty much undefeated other than a disqualification. I think he would have had a very strong case historically of being the greatest pound-for-pound fighter ever. And I think everything he's done since that has really, in a lot of people's mind, undermined his legacy. I mean, once the chin was exposed to something quite unlike what happened with Muhammad Ali's chin getting exposed, where we saw, oh, not only was he the greatest fighter ever as Cassius Clay, but once you can hit him, he has the greatest chin in the history of boxing as well. That wasn't the case with Roy. Roy doesn't have the greatest chin in the history of boxing. He can get hurt. He can get concussed. And he doesn't seem to handle it very well. Heavy punches, or even not so heavy punches. So I think that's led a lot of people to be pretty scared that as he slows down, the opponent he's fighting in Russia December 12th, Enzo, I mean, he's older too, but his punches, I mean, his fights only seem to end in knockouts. I think he has a very high knockout percentage of around 75%, and then every fight he's lost, which I think is 7 or 8 fights, he's been knocked out. So he goes in to either knock somebody out or get knocked out. If Roy isn't able to get out of the way of those punches the way he used to, that's, the guy can hit. And so it's just a little scary because once you've been knocked out hard, you do become more susceptible to being knocked out easier the next time. The brain is a very delicate thing. So Roy is putting himself at risk, like I said before, in the short term. And again, how much are we going to see of the damage 10 years from now, 20 years from now? But what he said to me was, I'm a grown man. I'm legally allowed to fight. Don't I have a right to choose what I do with my own life? And I agree with that, but I'm not necessarily excited about the prospect of it either, frankly. So that's kind of how I see it.
I want to go back to after he beats Ruiz. I've gone through this in my mind, like if I was hypothetically Roy's manager and he would listen to me, because that fight with Tyson, as you mentioned, almost happened. He would have been a 2-1 favorite back in 2003. And I thought, I never understood why he went down to fight Antonio Tarver. He had to drop so much weight and muscle, and he was exhausted. And that really set up for the rematch when he got knocked out in the second round and everything fell apart. Let's go hypothetically he stays in the heavyweight division. And if he, doesn't fight Tyson, or if he does, what happens? If he fights Chris Bird, what happens? Lennox Lewis, he mentioned fighting him, but that really wasn't going to happen. So let's play the hypothetical game. Jones continues fighting, but stays in the heavyweight division. What would you advise him to do? What do you think would have happened?
Well, what he told me what he wanted, and I mean, there's a bit of a conflicting narrative here. What he told me when I met with him was, all I wanted was Tyson. I wanted Tyson, and I was going to retire. Tyson would have been my Pacquiao Mayweather. It would have been a $100 pay-per-view. It would have been a dream fight, unlike there'd been in a long, long time. And I would have come at him just like Holyfield and just taken the fight to him. That's how you fight a Tyson. And I mean, he said the same thing about fighting Floyd Mayweather, that in some weird parallel universe, had they fought at 154 pounds, it's just like, realistically, Floyd is not as fast as I was, and you're telling me he's going to outpoint me with my hand speed and how active I am? It's never going to happen. So he's actually going to have to fight me. And if he's actually going to fight me, I'm going to knock him out. And he said, if you look at Tyson, what Holyfield did, he took the fight to him, and Holyfield never really got hit by Tyson in their 2 fights. Well, I guess the second one was abridged with the biting. But Holyfield really never did get hit, and he said, I think I could model that. I think I could do something similar. And I have knockout power. I have as much knockout power as Holyfield, so I could have taken the fight to Tyson, and I was going in that to knock him out. And, I mean, I think Roy, when he fought Ruiz, where a lot of people said, you're crazy to put yourself to be exposed to such a weight disadvantage, but Roy went at Ruiz. Roy took the fight to him. So I do take him at his word for probably trying to make what would have been a pretty exciting fight with Tyson. And just for the money involved, I think it would have been worth it, because really there's no other big money fight for Roy around there. And, one parallel that I think is an interesting one is you could say, look at what Roy did to James Toney in Toney's prime, and then look at what Toney did to Holyfield. Toney just beat the hell out of Holyfield, and is the only time I've ever seen Holyfield's will broken during a fight. You can actually see the look on his face where he wants to give up, and I've never seen that on Holyfield's face. I mean, I don't think I've ever seen a tougher fighter willing, the resilience of Holyfield but Tony just broke his will, just broke him down, and ended up knocking him out with a body shot. So I mean, I'd have to give Roy a shot, and I think after talking to Jim Lampley and a couple other people at HBO, they say that Roy might be the greatest color commentator that there's ever been because he can see things happen before they happen, unlike anybody else calling fights. And he was so analytical at breaking down these fights and I think persuasive in his argument that it became a lot more interesting of a hypothetical for me, Jones versus Tyson. And I think for his agenda, that would have been a great fight. But my one problem that nags at me is Roy talks a lot about, I would have this fight and then never fight again. But he had a lot of other things like that where he said, if I had that, I would never do it again. Some of those things ended up happening, like him losing. He said early on, if I ever lost bad, I'm never going to come back. He always did come back. And I think it's back to that gambler thing. I don't think there's anything that's going to happen that he's not going to say, I can do it better next time. That's just the way he's built. That's what created him into this, this great career that he had, is the same thing that could condemn him to a really disturbing fate.
It's crazy. As Seinfeld said, you got to leave them wanting more. And Jones didn't do that. And I love Jones. And, again, he was so nice to me. He gave me 30 minutes of his time a few years ago to promote a fight about 4 years ago. And I loved it. And it was a great interview. But, obviously, I wish he would have retired after the Ruiz fight. And he would have possibly gone down, as you talked about, greatest pound-for-pound boxer of all time, probably right next to Sugar Ray Robinson. But that's a distant memory. It was over 12 years ago. We're not thinking about that now. This is the Ari Lewis Show on Israel Sports and News Radio, joined by Brin-Jonathan Butler. Last question for Brin. Yuri Foreman fought over the weekend. We know he's not going to win a championship again. I love Yuri. Yuri's helped me out a lot. He's fighting basically because he had a bad loss a couple years ago, wants to kind of have some pride. Would that be your assessment pretty much?
Yeah, and he won, and good for him. It's been 2 years, and he fought bravely, won a decision. I hope that's enough for him, but it's boxing, so I doubt it. But, I thought he did really well. I mean, it's a nice, happy ending if he allows it to be an ending.
Yeah, I mean, you see, Dmitry Salita, the other Orthodox Jewish boxer, kind of go more in the promotion route. His fight with Hector Camacho Jr. was canceled about 3.5 years ago, and he kind of said, all right, I need to move on. I thought Yuri was going to move on, but kind of didn't. And it's interesting, Yuri became champion, and in the fight against Miguel Cotto, was not winning the fight, but still fought on when he tore his ACL. And what was interesting was that referee, Arthur McKinney Jr., was giving Yuri Foreman advice in that fight after he tore his ACL. Have you ever seen that from a referee?
No, no, I haven't. It was very, very unusual. But, yeah, and I think Salita is an interesting one to mention, too, because, I'm good friends with his former manager. But, he had a great career, too, and then, stepped into the first punch that Amir Khan threw, and you just went, oh, God, what's happened here? So I'm glad that he's moved into promotion. He's a very bright guy, and, I've seen him at events, and he seems a lot more put together than most boxers after they leave their career behind. So it's nice to see that.
Yeah, and they're both nice guys. I've talked to them off the air plenty of times, and there's nothing fake about them. Kind of what you see on TV is how they are in real life. So good people, as you are, Brin-Jonathan Butler. Before we go, give people a plug where they can read more about your work. And, of course, you have Bleacher Report coming out December 9th, so tell people all about that.
Yeah, the Roy Jones profile is going to be December 9th on Bleacher Report. And if they're interested in Cuba, they can pick up my book, The Domino Diaries, or an ebook on Guillermo Rigondeaux called A Cuban Boxer's Journey, which can be bought on Amazon or anywhere else they sell books.
All right, be safe. You're not committing a crime during this interview, are you, Brin? We hear cop cars in the back.
It's just New York City.
And on that note, we got to end the interview there. Brin-Jonathan Butler, thanks for being on the program. Always fun. Always appreciate it.
Oh, my pleasure. Always fun. Take care, man.
Thanks so much. Be well. Take care.